Okay, Mr. Phobes here. This is a mini lesson on color study number 2. And what we're going to do here is do a 4 open form compositions, and we're going to study each one in a prismatic color scheme, a muted color scheme, a chromatic gray color scheme, and a high key value color scheme. We're going to use primaries, secondaries, and intermediates, and then we're going to create saturation and value variety through complementary mixings, tints, tones, and shades. So here's an example that I did a couple of years ago. What I want you to do is to keep to 6 simple shapes in a ground. Um, you can use geometric or organic. Keeping them non-objective just makes the problem a little bit easier to accomplish. If you start getting hung up in the shape development, you might make it more complicated than it needs to be. The way I accomplished mine is I actually cut the shapes out and then I painted them. But you could paint it directly to the board. It depends, on what your skill level is. Um, each shape will be a different hue, including the ground. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 shapes, and then my ground is this blue. And then you can see how it changes. Here are all the same exact hues that have been now added, about 10% of the complement, and then about 40% of the complement, and then these are all the same hues with white added to them, creating tints. This is a PDF that you can download from the assignments page if you go to the color studies. And again, it just describes the way that I created these 6 different, or excuse me, these 4 different saturation compositions. So, how do you choose your hues? Um, what you want to do is choose hues that as they begin to migrate towards their saturations, and especially towards the chromatic grays, they're not going to look the same. So one of the best strategies is to pick every other hue on the color wheel. That gives you 6, and then you pick one hue as your ground. So this is one way to do it. You could certainly you could say instead of the magenta, maybe you wanted to pick the violet and the blue. That would be fine because they're far enough apart in hue that would still work. Certainly, you don't want to pick red and red magenta together, or red magenta and magenta. They're too close together, and once you start getting it, you can see when you get into their chromatic grays, they're much too close together. All right, so this is just one of the other things you're going to do is you're going to create a palette. So this is a palette that represents the palette of the different color schemes you're going to use in each 4 of the compositions. Um, the prismatic hues, again, are the hues that are at their purest and most saturated. The muted hues are going to be the hues with about 10 to 20% of the complement, and then the chromatic grays again are about 30 to 40% of the complement. When you create the muted hues, let's not add any black. You still need to create a broad range of values, so you're just going to do that by adding the complement. On the chromatic grays, however, you can start adding black, and that will create a tone if it's got some white in it. So, one thing you might want to do is this chromatic gray is created from the red with the complement of cyan in it. But another way you could do it is you could mix up some gray and add it to the red, and that will also give you a chromatic gray. It'll just be a little bit more saturated. So you could try that. I would do a mix of some complements and then some adding gray to them. And then the high key values, you're just going to take your prismatics and you're going to add white to all of them. And there should still be some range of value, but we want it to be a narrow range of value. The first three, there should be a broad range of value, but the high key, there should be a very narrow range of value. And one of the other things you're going to do when you do your palette is a color interaction study. So you're going to come up with two grounds, and then you're going to come up with uh, a hue that you're going to either paint, or you can do this from the color cards. And the idea is that you're, by creating different grounds, you're going to make the two same colors look different. So this dot and this dot are exactly the same hue, but they're looking different because of their grounds. Again, if you stare here, you begin to see that this one begins to, its bias moves towards the violet, and this one, the bias moves towards the yellow. That means that this is probably, it looks like it's a yellow that's had the complement of, or near complement of the violet mixed into it, and that's why that's working. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples. Here's one that was done by Stephanie Bradley in 2016. It's completely painted, so it's not cut out. She just very carefully laid out four compositions. And if you notice, they're almost exactly the same. There's a few little differences, but the one thing that I think is really poetic is that the bird moves in each one of the compositions, which is what birds would do. But you see the moon or the sun, whatever it is, stays in the same position. The leaves are in the same position. The branches in the same position. She's using the orange as her ground, and then she's used the other six colors for these. So again, you can see that here's her prismatic. It's very highly saturated. Here's her muted. Here's her chromatic grays. This is a very good chromatic gray composition. Look at this. She's got one really dark value and one really light value, and then she's got values in between, and that's great. That's what we're looking for, is a variety of value in these first three. And then her high key is those hues all added white. This is the palette that she created, so she painted these as she was studying these. This interaction of color is not an excellent example. You can see that the hue that she used for the dot is too dark, because when we see it on the blue ground, it almost disappears. So it should be a value between the very light yellow and the darker blue. And this is our last example. This is done by Holly Kogan last year, and it's an example of how you would use the color chips. So again, the yellow is very hard to find, so what she did is she just painted her foregrounds using the yellow and creating muted chromatic gray and high key of the prismatic. And then she took her cards and she cut out the same shape. So you look, she's got her blue here, and you can see this is a very saturated blue, and this does indeed look like it probably has a little bit of the complement. This is a chromatic gray. It probably could have a little bit of more of the complement, and then this certainly is the high key of that. So you can see that the hues are pretty much the same. This may be a little bit biased towards red, but she's got the right idea, and you can see that here's the green, and you can see how it changed to muted to chromatic gray, and then here it is. So this is a little bit hard to do because you're not mixing them. You have to find the cards that remain the same hue, but you have to be able to visually identify its change in terms of muted, chromatic gray, and high key. So that's it.